our laws say that you can have a certain level of pesticides in your food. And with some toxins, that makes sense, right? If you've heard the expression, the dose makes the poison, there are things that are toxic that maybe if we have enough of them, they cause real problems. But if we have little tiny amounts, it's not so bad, or at least it's livable. Um, the problem is with neurotoxins, again, these are chemicals that attack the most sensitive parts of our bodies that are really not good at repairing themselves, right? It's not like a skin cell. Um, these are really important, really sensitive, and really hard to fix parts of our body. And so we have to be especially careful with neurotoxins. And in the 90s, Congress passed the Food Quality Protection Act unanimously, if you can believe it. And again, this is the law that sets the maximum level of pesticides in food. And we actually petitioned the EPA because we think that EPA is cooking the math when it comes to neonics.
I'm Meg Carney, an outdoor and environmental journalist, and this is the Outdoor Minimalist podcast. Thank you for joining us so that together we can create a better outdoor space as we recreate. What if one of the most widely used pesticides in the world is something most people have never even heard of, despite likely encountering it every single day? In episode 206 of the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, we are discussing something called neonicotinoids, often called neonics. They're the most commonly used insecticide in the United States. They're applied to crops, our lawns, gardens, golf courses, and even found in flea and tick treatments for our pets. They're designed to make plants themselves toxic to insects, but that efficiency comes at a pretty steep cost to people and the planet. So how are chemicals with these kinds of impacts still allowed in our food, water, and everyday products? And why has federal regulation lagged so far behind the science? To help answer these questions and more, I'm joined by Daniel Raichel, an expert on pollinators and pesticides at the Natural Resources Defense Council. The NRDC is an international nonprofit environmental organization with more than 3 million members and online activists. Since 1970, the NRDC has used science, policy, law, and people power to protect public health and confront the climate crisis. Dan is an attorney by training and directs NRDC's work focused on protecting bees and other wildlife from toxic pesticides. Before joining NRDC's Nature program, he co-directed the Community Fracking Defense Project and worked on industrial pollution cleanup in the New York region. So thank you for joining me on the Outdoor Minimalist podcast today. This is a more unique topic, but I think it is one that is really relevant to the listeners. So I'm excited to talk about it. And I guess before we jump right into things, we should define what exactly we are talking about. So apologies to everyone listening if I mispronounce this, but if they have not heard this term before, can you define what hold on, let me see. What are neonicotinoids? There we go. Okay.
That's good. You got it. Well, first, thanks for having me. And yeah, for your listeners who've never heard about them before, neonicotinoids, or neonics for short, are neurotoxic insecticides, which means they are pesticides designed to kill insects by attacking their nerves. And they do that by mimicking nicotine. Actually, the word neonicotinoid means new nicotine-like substance. And the three big reasons why people should care about them, and especially your listeners, is well, one, they're probably the most widely used insecticides in U.S. history. Two, they may be the most ecologically destructive insecticides we've seen since DDT. And three, they're actually kind of ubiquitous in our environment and our bodies. And there's growing concerns about the threats that they pose to our health as well as the health of the natural world.
Yeah, and we'll get into this in a little bit more detail, but when we hear pesticides, we often just think, okay, that's what's going on crops. Maybe that's Roundup that you're putting in your front yard. But where are people actually encountering these neonics in their everyday life? And where would they maybe not realize they're coming from?
Yeah, so neonics are kind of everywhere. Again, they're the most widely used insecticides possibly in our nation's history. And so they're in all sorts of products. Anywhere where you'd want to kill an insect or a bug, there's usually a neonic product for that use. So they're in all sorts of indoor household products. They're in veterinary products for your dog and your cat. Um, so you can have direct exposure through those, but and there's lawn and garden products too. So folks can get directly exposed to all of those ways, but most likely for most people, they're going to be exposed through contaminated water and food. So on the food side, we see neonics showing up in fruits and vegetables all over the place. You know, apples, grapes, leafy greens, tomatoes, even things like baby food and applesauce. So we see them fairly commonly in those showing up in testing of those products. We also see that neonics are really prodigious water contaminants. So federal testing across the country found that on any given day, neonics are in about half of our streams nationwide. And we're also seeing them in groundwater in different places in the country. So chlorination treatment, which is what most water systems use, chlorination disinfectant, does not remove neonics from the water supply. Only things like advanced filtration does. So chances are, and most water systems don't use that filtration. So chances are, if your neonic source water is contaminated, it's going to show up on your in your tap. And again, that's how most people are going to be exposed.
Okay, that makes sense with the comparison you made then to DDT, and that seems like like a comparison most people would likely be familiar with. So I guess with neonics being compared to them, what makes neonics then uniquely destructive? And also, how much are they actually needed throughout this process of using insecticides?
Yeah. So the things that make neonics sort of uniquely destructive, because right, there's a lot of pesticides, there's a lot of toxics in our environment. Why do we care so much about just this one type of insecticide? And there's three big reasons. The first is that neonics may be the most or among the most potent insecticides ever created. They're really super duper toxic to bees and other insects. Um, and they've made US agriculture since their introduction somewhere between 10 and 50 times more harmful to insect life. So, really, really potent insecticides. That's number one. Number two, they're really good at contaminating whole ecosystems. So neonics are designed to permeate plants, to get into the leaves, the roots, the nectar, the pollen, everything. Basically, they make the plant itself the pesticide. And that was a new thing, right? When neonics hit the scene in the mid 90s, right? That was a new thing. So that allowed neonics to be applied in new ways. They can be sprayed, and they are, but the most common way is that they're literally painted on crop seeds, corn and soybean in the main. And the idea is as that seed is growing into a plant, it's meant to literally soak up the pesticide coating through its roots, distribute it through the plant, and make all parts of the plant toxic. The problem is, of that coating, only 2 to 5% get into the target plant. The other 95 plus percent stay in the environment where they persist for years and years. And those same properties that let them permeate the plant also means they're really mobile in the environment. So anytime it rains, anytime there's irrigation, if it's a lawn application, anytime you water your lawn, those neonics are moving through the soil. They're contaminating new soil, sometimes at long distances away. If that new soil has plants in it, those plants soak up the pesticides, they become toxic, their pollen, their nectar. If there's a water supply nearby, that water supply becomes polluted. Um, And again, remember, these are really potent. The thin coating on just one neonic treated corn seed has enough active ingredient to kill about 250,000 bees. So super duper potent, right? And then again, 95% of that staying in the soil, persisting year after year. And then the third problem with neonics is they're all over the place. Again, used on just a massive, possibly unprecedented scale. And to give you a sense, again, one neonic treated corn seed, enough active ingredient to kill 250,000 bees. Multiply that times 30,000 seeds per acre for typical acre of corn. Multiply that by 90 to 100 million acres nationwide. That's about 5% of the land area of the lower 48 states. And that's just one crop, right? That's just corn. So yeah, they're all over lawns, gardens, golf courses, other crops. And what's happening is we're using these pesticides on a massive scale year after year. We're using them in the same places every year. And they're persisting for many years. So what you do is you get this buildup of toxicity in the soil over a huge area that is expanding every time it rains to get into every nook and cranny of the ecosystem. Soil, water, plant life, wildlife, and as it turns out, our bodies too. So that's sort of the nature of the problem and why neonics are so problematic. Now, what makes this almost criminal, and you asked, like, are these needed? And the truth is about 90+% of the neonic use is completely unnecessary and wasteful. So in the biggest use, again, are these coatings on corn and soybean seeds and wheat seeds. And what the science shows is in the vast majority of places that these crops are grown, these seed coatings are providing no economic benefits to farmers. So very rarely are they increasing yields, right? Increasing the number of crops grown. But even when they do, in those rare instances, the companies charge for that coating, right? It's not free. So if you match that cost versus the yield benefit, economically, it's a wash. So this makes, the seed coating is probably the largest and dumbest use of neonics. But there are other dumb uses too, right? In the lawn and garden space, which are much smaller by area, but they're used at much higher rates per acre, sometimes 10 or 20 times more than the rates per acre in agriculture. So you can get these, it's funny, we see this in the water testing too. You get these sort of toxic hotspots in urban, suburban areas where there's a lot of lawn care products being used. And the vast majority of cases they're being used prophylactically without need, right? Treating for pests that don't exist, sort of like taking an antibiotic now, just in case you might get sick in March. So needless use in maybe 80+% of the cases there. But even when you would want to use an insecticide, there are a number of safer alternatives in the lawn and garden space. So yeah, big, massive use, really problematic. 90% of it just not needed.
I want to ask then why is it being used in the first place, but I'm not sure if that would bring us down like a rabbit hole at all.
I'll try not to go down the rabbit hole too far. I can talk about the seeds, right? And the situation we have now is 4 companies control, and I don't know the exact number. I want to say 80%, but don't quote me on that. But like the vast majority of the market for corn and soybean seeds. And if you've driven around, the heart of the country, that's a lot of land, right? But those companies are also the companies that make the pesticides, right? So the companies that make the seeds are the ones that make the pesticides. And they use their power in the market a lot of times to control that market and to make sure that, they're maximizing the amount of revenue they're getting off of selling. And look, again, they charge for the pesticides on the seed. So that's a profit center for them. And also what's happened a lot of times these days is the folks that are selling, the seed dealers that are selling these seeds to farmers, they're also affiliated with these large companies. And even in cases where It's not automatically on the seed first, right? In some cases, it's just automatically on there. You have to sort of buy the package. Even in the cases where there's more choice, those dealers are going to be recommending these products. And the information that they're getting from the companies is, hey, no, you really need this. This is really important, which is just simply not true, right? We know from the independent research from like big ag universities that's just not true. But that's sort of the system we have in place.
Always follow the money, as they say.
Yeah,
So, I guess if we back up then in time, you did talk about how, since it is kind of infiltrating the whole plant and then permeating out into the environment and affecting the whole ecosystem, what was kind of the first primary alarm bell for scientists then that these were having a negative impact on the environment?
totally. Yeah. So bees were our canary in the coal mine. So folks may remember about 20 years ago, mid 2000s, we just started losing honeybees in mass, right? Up until that point, beekeepers were losing maybe 10-15% of their honeybee colonies every year, mostly due to winter cold. And after that point, sometime in the mid 2000s, those numbers just skyrocketed. They jumped to 30, 40, 50% a year. Last year was actually the worst year on record for honeybee losses, right? These losses have persisted to this day. And I think beekeepers lost about 56% of their honeybee colonies last year on average. So huge, huge numbers. And look, there's a lot of problems affecting bees and other pollinators. There's climate change, there's habitat loss, there's parasites and pathogens, but none of those problems suddenly got worse in 2006. What did happen at that time, if you look at a chart of neonic use, it skyrockets, right, at around that point. And this is not when neonics were first introduced, it's actually when neonics start to be used as coatings on crop seeds, right? And that's when their use really takes off, right? You know, millions of acres nationwide. So that sends a really clear signal. And since then, the science has been unequivocal, right? Linking neonics to these losses of pollinators. But what we've learned in the last 20 years is bees are just the canary in the coal mine. So honeybees are not native to the United States. They're essentially livestock. And we count them. That's the benefit, right? We don't count all of our wild bee species and butterfly species and all of the millions of insects, species of insects. But we do count honeybees. So that sent a really clear signal. But what we've learned is what's happening to honeybees, which, by the way, again, they're livestock. So there's a whole industry that breeds and replaces them. So we have about as many honeybee colonies as we ever have. We're just frantically replacing honeybees every year as they're dying in mass. We've sort of holding this system together with duct tape. But our native bees and butterflies and insects, they don't have this industry replacing them every year. And what we see is our ecosystems hollowing out right in front of our eyes. And again, the link is there to these really hyper insect toxic pesticides.
Yeah, and I mean, they are impacting more than just the insects themselves. And so when it is spreading throughout the environment, you said that it's kind of staying there for a long time. So is this reversible? Can it be removed at all? I know you mentioned that some types of filtration might work to remove it from water, but is there a way to then, since we have so much already in the environment, to take them out and get back to a healthier ecosystem?
So the short answer is right. These are not, as far as we know, like not forever chemicals. They do break down eventually, even though they're relatively persistent. So there is a way out of the hole, likely if we stop digging. But just to put a little bit finer point to like what is the impact these are having in our environment? Um, I think where folks maybe can see it is for those of your listeners who are old enough to remember like driving around a rural area in the 1990s in summertime. You know, you'd have to turn on your windshield wipers, right? Whether it was raining or not, just to get all of the bugs off of your windshield. And think of when the last time it was that you had to do that. So what's happening is like our ecosystems are literally hollowing out from the bottom up. And we don't always notice it, but I'll tell you that other species do, right? So we've lost a massive amount of birds, for instance. We've lost 30% of our birds in the last 50 years. And after that study came out, two other scientists went into that data set and they teased out the birds that rely on insects versus the birds that don't. And if you look, the birds that don't rely on insects have actually been doing kind of okay, right? They've been maintaining their population. Unfortunately, the vast majority of birds rely on insects. So if you have fewer bugs, you have fewer birds. And we see good science linking neonic use to the losses of birds and bird biodiversity across the country. Same thing happens in aquatic ecosystems. We've seen studies connecting neonics to the collapse of fisheries and at really, really low levels, right? Parts per trillion. And we know that neonics contaminate our waters across the country at those levels, at levels that EPA itself has said harm aquatic ecosystems. There was actually just a good study from USGS that said neonics pose a widespread, persistent threat to our water systems across the country, our water ecosystems. And that has ripple effects to fish, et cetera. And again, and neonics are also directly toxic to, we've seen studies linking neonics to birth defects in white-tailed deer in controlled studies. And we know that, again, that one neonic treated corn seed that has enough active ingredient to kill 250,000 bees also has enough active ingredient to kill a small songbird. And birds definitely eat these seeds during planting time. So there's many, many ways that these pesticides are affecting our ecosystems. But again, good news is if we stop using them or stop using them wastefully, right, in the places that we don't need to, which is the vast majority of the problem, things will get better. We've seen that in other jurisdictions where we see neonic water contamination go down. Europe actually banned neonics almost 10 years ago. They're still finding them in all sorts of weird places. So it does take kind of a while. It may take a generation for neonics to filter out of our environment, but it can, again, first step of getting out of a hole is to stop digging. So, and we can stop digging.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that there is a way out. We will talk a little bit more about other solutions near the end. So don't people listening don't feel like that this is like all doom and gloom. We just want to present the issue up front. And I mean, humans are a part of the ecosystem, right? So surely the neonics are also impacting us as well. And something that you mentioned earlier is that they're neurotoxic and can mimic nicotine, which I find really interesting. And so, what does that mean then for humans anywhere in the life cycle process? I'm sure that more research has been done on reproductive health than anything. But if there are any sort of like scientific studies or groupings of individuals that be more at risk, I don't know.
So I think what we're most worried about is children's health and their neurological health, and especially, young children, children in the womb. Um, so neonics are neurotoxic, and we know that children are exceptionally sensitive to neurotoxic chemicals, like we all are, right? Nerve damage oftentimes is permanent, right? You don't get those nerves back, and so it's really impactful. But it's especially impactful if you're someone whose brain is still developing, right? And exposure to a neurotoxin at the wrong time in that development can fundamentally change your brain architecture. So what we see, and even though neonics are relatively new, so we don't have as much science as we have for other older chemicals, we see neonic exposures in the womb linked with cognitive impairments, birth defects of the heart and brain, autism spectrum disorder. So some of these neurological impacts, right? Higher rates. And while more research definitely needs to be done on human populations, that corroborates really strongly with what we see in animal testing. Actually, studies submitted by the chemical manufacturers themselves link neonic exposures in the womb and in rodent testing, rat testing, to thinner brains, right? Thinner key areas of the brain, like the cortex. Our staff scientist here likes to say that you can't ask a rat how it did on a second grade math test. meaning you can't always look at a rat's brain and know like what the impact of a chemical is. But here we don't have to ask that rat about its math test. We can see that these chemicals are associated with really dramatic impacts um, on just the structure of the brain and the formation. So that's all scary. We know too from adults that have been exposed, we're seeing like neurotoxic symptoms, nicotine-like symptoms, things like dizziness, memory loss, tremors, headaches, etc. So there are impacts on adults too, for sure. And in extreme cases with like big exposures, you can see things like seizures and really, um, you know, powerful sort of neurotoxic effects. The other thing that's come out recently is that it's not just, even though they're neurotoxic, it's not just impacts on our brains. They impact our reproductive systems as well. And again, this is something we also see in the animal testing, but we have good data in really with male effects. So lower neonic exposures being associated with lower testosterone, lower sperm count, damage to the quality of sperm. And we have some new animal testing on ovaries too that show that neonics likely attack mammalian ovaries, or at least in mice, and have fewer egg follicles. So those are the things that create eggs in order so that folks can reproduce. So really impacts across the board. We see neonics associated with impacts on insulin regulation and metabolism. So we're just learning all of these impacts. But the key thing here is this is relevant to all of us. These aren't just like happening in a lab. We're all exposed to neonics, right? So data from 2016 shows that nationwide testing, about half the population has neonics in their body on any given day. More recent testing of pregnant women from 2017 to 2020 showed that about 95% of the women had neonics in their bodies, and that those levels were increasing every year. So, and we don't have data. Then COVID happened, and but the data that we have shows that we should all be concerned about how neonics may be affecting our health because we're all exposed.
Yeah, and I'm sure the exposure kind of varies according to location. Like if you live in a very rural area, maybe you have higher water contamination, or are there like more hotspots in certain regions of the country, or is it kind of like across the board because it's used so pervasively?
It's gonna really depend, right? With water contamination, sometimes we're seeing them more in agricultural areas, and it depends on the chemicals too. Certain neonics are used more in agriculture, certain neonics are used more in lawn care. Um, so we definitely see them, but we see them across the board. Again, sometimes the suburban uses, the lawn care uses, are really concentrated. So they're really good at getting into water supplies. It can depend on like the geology of your area. If you have a really shallow aquifer, maybe those neonics are getting into groundwater. It may depend how much it rains. So it's really sort of across the board. In fruit and vegetables, probably we'll see those more. That's sort of more uniform across the country because we're all sort of eating fruits and veggies grown in the same places. But suffice to say that again, these chemicals, you may not have heard about them before, but they are most likely a part of your daily life.
And there is one use that we haven't really touched on yet, but I do want to touch on briefly is their use in flea and tick products for animals. So this one was really interesting when we originally talked because especially when we're giving it to animals like our dogs, oftentimes they're eating them, right? They're consuming this chemical, and that to me is alarming knowing what we know, right? So I do just want to ask, like, what should pet owners know when they're choosing a product? Because tick diseases are also something that we want to avoid. So there's kind of like this double-edged sword here. Like either you're using a preventative or you're risking exposure to something else.
Yeah, so it's really tricky. Like again, 90% of the neonic use we know is dumb and unnecessary, right? There's really common sense solutions for that. But that leaves the other 10% where it's a little murkier. And I think veterinary uses are one of those areas. Um, you know, right. It works the same way in your pet as it does in a plant. You feed it to your pet oftentimes, and then it just sort of pervades, it just sort of goes throughout your entire pet and makes your pet's skin and hair and etc. toxic to insects like ticks. We don't have uses like that for people, by the way. If you want to get rid of ticks or prevent against ticks, if you're walking in the woods, we don't give you pesticides to eat, but we do that for pets. And look, my wife is a veterinarian. Um, you know, I've been led to believe that this may be better than some of the other treatment alternatives, although I'm no expert on veterinary uses. One thing I can tell you is that a number of pet collars that have been sort of soaked with these insecticides before, neonics and another insecticide, um, the Seresto collar in particular, there was a study that came out several years ago showing that there were something close to 100,000 poisoning reports. So these are reports given to EPA. So this is not all of the poisoning that happens. These are just reports to EPA with, I think it was 1,700 pet deaths associated with these collars. And I think more recently that number has risen to 2,500. So, right, these pet collars that are soaked with the pesticides can be really harmful to pets. It's also an exposure route for people, right? If you have small children, they like to hang on to the pets, um, particularly around like the neck area. I didn't believe it until I had small kids, but they put everything in their mouths and they have their mouths like on our dogs at the time. So I would be really careful about the pet collars in particular.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. I feel like it would be relevant for a lot of listeners. I've always tried to stay away from those collars. I've seen so many lawsuits, not even just the brand that you're explaining, but from other brands as well. And you've mentioned the EPA several times. And oftentimes when we think of the EPA, we think of them as this protective agency. And I know that maybe that view has changed, especially under the current administration. But how do you feel the agency is doing in terms of managing these chemicals and the exposure? Like, are they actually doing a good job or are they failing in some ways?
So we think the agency is failing, especially when it comes to human health. And so EPA sets the maximum allowable level of pesticides in foods. Your listeners may not be surprised to know that, yeah, the foods we eat have pesticides in them. And our laws say that you can have a certain level of pesticides in your food. And with some toxins, that makes sense, right? If you've heard the expression, the dose makes the poison, there are things that are toxic that maybe if we have enough of them, they cause real problems. But if we have little tiny amounts, it's not so bad, or at least it's livable. The problem is with neurotoxins, again, these are chemicals that attack the most sensitive parts of our bodies that are really not good at repairing themselves, right? It's not like a skin cell. Um, these are really important, really sensitive, and really hard to fix parts of our body. And so we have to be especially careful with neurotoxins. And in the 90s, Congress passed the Food Quality Protection Act unanimously, if you can believe it. And again, this is the law that sets the maximum level of pesticides in food. And we actually petitioned the EPA because we think that EPA is cooking the math when it comes to neonics. And the three big things that they're doing there is one, the way they set these maximum levels is they look at testing submitted by industry, again, on rodents. This is what I was talking about with like the thinner brains. And we think they're ignoring those impacts, right? And they're setting the safe level too high, right? They're not accounting for some of these impacts they're seeing. So that's problem number one. We think that level should be way lower in terms of where they start their math in terms of what the safe level should be. The other problem that EPA is doing is once it sets like what it thinks from the science is an acceptable level, the law says you have to lower that by a factor of 10 to protect children because we know what's harmful to an adult, children are more sensitive, right, than adults. So we want to be really, really sure things are safe. So they lower that safe amount by tenfold. EPA, we think illegally, waived that protection. They say, oh, we don't need to do that for the neonics, even though they had studies showing neurotoxic impacts on rats, again, thinner brains. So we think that that was unpermissible. And then the last thing EPA is doing is they're looking at each neonic separately, right, and creating a different level. But we know all the neonics kind of affect us in the same way. And under the law, there's things that harm us in the same way should be factored in together. And we know that multiple neonics are in people's bodies from the testing. We know that it's very common to be exposed to multiple neonics, not just one. So between those three things, we think EPA is setting the level in the wrong place. They're allowing at least 10 times more neonics in our food and water than what the law allows, and maybe even much more than that. So we're petitioning the agency. We're actually suing them now because they didn't respond to that petition. But we're trying to get the agency to do the right thing, but it hasn't for decades.
I'm getting some deja vu from like the EPA's management of other chemicals. And we've talked a lot about PFAS or forever chemicals on our other show. And it kind of follows a similar trajectory, it feels like to me. So, with all of that information that we presented, how, I guess, can we combat this? Because it seems like, similar to the management of forever chemicals, a lot of the changes have been happening because of regulation and not necessarily federal regulation, state regulation. So, are there certain states who have implemented any policy level actions that have been effective? And why are states leading this when the federal government could potentially have more of an impact?
Yeah. So again, we see at the federal level, EPA is kind of asleep at the wheel. And the pesticide office, EPA is not a monolith, right? It's like there's different parts of the agency. And just to be real, the part that deals with pesticides historically doesn't matter the administration, has not been very good at controlling pesticides in a way that protect people and the environment. In Congress, I don't know if you've looked at Congress right now, but the prospect of passing a law that would like restrict pesticide use, not very likely. So that leaves things to the states, and we see the states stepping up, and we see other jurisdictions stepping up. So Europe, as I mentioned, banned most of the major neonics in 2018. They actually started that in 2013 with a partial ban. But just over the border in Canada, the provinces, Quebec and Ontario, have been addressing just those, what I talked about earlier, like the dumb uses, right? The high cost, low benefit uses, the seed coatings and the lawn and garden uses. And the model there is like a need-based use program. So if you want to use a neonic on your corn or your soybean seed, just get a prescription from your agronomist that says that you need it, right? That it's treating an actual pest problem and that you're not just using it, again, like taking an antibiotic now, just in case I might get sick in a month or two. And once that system was in place, we saw neonic use fall from 100% in corn, 50% in soybeans, to less than 0.5% in corn and 0% in soybeans, without any crop loss, associated crop loss, or switching to more harmful alternatives. So this is the model that a number of states in the US, based on the success of what has just happened across the border, are starting to adopt. New York passed the Birds and Bees Protection Act, which has a similar system, that prescription system, and Vermont followed suit. And in those laws too, there's also restrictions on lawn and garden uses as well. In New York, it's a ban. And we've seen other states, for example, New Jersey and Connecticut have also, and Nevada have also banned those lawn and garden uses. And in states where there's not a lot of corn and soybean, oftentimes that's most of the use. So we see a number of states stepping up and taking action. And these are really common sense solutions that get, depending on the law, anywhere between 80 and 90% of the neonic use in that state. And that's a great place to start, right? Let's start with the easy stuff and then, see where we need to go from there, if anywhere. But there's really common sense stuff that we can do right now. And the good news is the states are beginning to do it.
Yeah, and I think that that's great that we're seeing at least some movement from some states and that there's examples internationally, right? But I think as an average citizen, then hearing that it feels a lot out of our control. So, I guess to kind of close out the interview, what do you think the average person or individual could really be doing? One, to lower their exposure, and then two, to hopefully push more of this type of regulation that benefits them and their health?
Yeah, I think to limit your exposure, again, food and water are going to be the big exposure pathways. And I know it's not always an option for some folks because of cost or availability, but we do know that in organic production, where neonics are prohibited, we see much lower levels of neonics in food. We do occasionally see neonics because if you think about it, if an organic farm is next to, say, a golf course or a conventional cornfield, and they're irrigating from the same water supply, those neonics they're very good at getting everywhere. So we do see some neonics in certain organic crops at low levels, but that's a really good way to eliminate or really, really reduce exposure through food is to purchase only organic produce. The other, for the water side of things, granular active carbon filtration, so the same filtration that's in Brita, does remove neonics or is pretty good at it. Again, most water systems don't use that because it's expensive, but that's something that folks can do themselves if they're concerned about their water supply potentially being contaminated. And then the other thing is, try not to use pesticides, right? If you can. Try not to use them in your lawn, certainly. I know sometimes sometimes you do have to deal with pest issues, and the pests are a problem. And if you're using something in your house, there's definitely, in those applications, certain things that are really nasty, maybe even nastier than neonics when it comes to our own health. So you have to make those decisions on a case-by-case basis. But where you can, just try not to use pesticides. Certainly don't use them before you have a problem.
Well, are there other things that you want to share? Are there resources that the NRDC has regarding neonics and how to reduce your exposure?
Yeah, I think there's definitely resources on our website. We have a Toxic Truth video and Toxic Truth fact sheet, and we're coming out with more fact sheets. And I think, one thing I would encourage folks to, we work in various states, and I think a number of states are trying to take action. Colorado, Minnesota, we've seen movement in states, around neonics in states like Maryland and Pennsylvania as well, and Michigan. So I think all across the country, there's real interest in that. And we're seeing more state legislators introduce bills about neonics. So one thing that you can do too, folks can do, I should mention, is call your state senator, call your state representative. If you call your federal senator, they'll definitely record it, and it's definitely worth doing. It's definitely worth reaching out to your federal electeds. But those state representatives, they really listen when people call. People think it's not valuable, but let me tell you, there is somebody that is taking notes every time you call your state reps. And so if you want to see action on neonics, let them know. Maybe your one call is not going to be the deciding factor, but if a state rep gets a dozen calls on an issue, or maybe even 5 or 6, they're going to start paying attention to it. So don't discount the power of your voice.
Thanks for listening. And if you like what you hear,
let me know. Leave a review and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Instagram at outdoor.minimalist.book, on YouTube, or subscribe to our weekly newsletter at theoutdoorminimalist.com. For even more updates, other educational resources, and to help build an outdoor community with the shared goal to create a better outdoor space as we recreate.